there are historical parallels, starting from the famous axis, Rome, Berlin, Tokyo, Roberto, as it was called. That Roberto didn't have a very happy ending, but after the war, there are similarities in the historical developments of the three countries, which I illustrate with a table, which is in fact the outline of my paper. It is incredibly boringly chronological. Reconstruction period, all three were suffered and therefore grew very rapidly compared to my comparator, which is the rest of the OECD area. Economic miracles during the Golden Age, more in Japan than elsewhere, but in all three countries. Still relatively rapid growth compared to the OECD in the 20 years that followed the second oil shock. Notice that Italy, during those 20 years, grew significantly more rapidly than the rest of the OECD area. And then the dubious record of being the three slowest growing countries in the whole of the OECD area over the last 15 years or so. Let me start very briefly with the construction period. Olson advanced the thesis that rapid growth in Italy, Germany, Japan was thanks to the fact that distributional coalitions were destroyed. There's virtually no evidence for that in Germany, or very little for Japan, none in Italy, because nobody in Italy has ever discussed the issue. On the other hand, there were reforms nonetheless. Things did change during this period, even if there wasn't a bonfire. Arguably, the Italian reforms were much more modest than the very radical Japanese reforms imposed by the Americans and the fairly radical German reforms. Two examples. Land reform. Italy did a land reform. Compared to what Japan did, it was minimal, absolutely minimal. Japanese expropriated 40% of landowners' land. In Italy, there was a transfer of perhaps up to 10% and not more. Interesting, Germany did something during this period which I think paved the way for subsequent social consensus. The Soziale Marktwirtschaft was initiated then. A major pension reform in the early 50s, Mitbestimmung, the fact that a huge advance, I think, in social relations in Germany, the fact that unions sit on the boards of major companies was approved in 1952. Italy resisted many of these changes, was less prone to. Marcello Di Cecco talked about the American authorities' views of what was happening in Italy at the time and how they were resisted by the Italian authorities. If only the Americans had been more insistent, arguably things might have turned out better in subsequent periods. Admittedly, the next period was very good. The Golden Age was there for everybody. Catch-up was the most obvious common feature for all three countries. On my PC, I show elegant dots. The Bank of Italy has software which clearly transforms them into ugly pencils or whatever, but it's still, you can still see it. It's the simplest of all convergence hypotheses. I think it's an extraordinarily good fit. The only two deviations are Ireland, which in the Golden Age did not participate, and to some extent Japan. Germany and Italy, DNI, you can see them, are bang on the regression line. The paper then has quite a lot on whether there was social capability in the three countries. Ala Abramovich talks about whether growth was export-led in Italy, Japan, and Germany. No time to discuss these things. The only thing I want to point out is that during this period, there was one specific Italian feature. The paper concentrates more on Italy than on the other two countries for obvious reasons. There was a specific Italian feature that was missing elsewhere, the autunno caldo. The autunno caldo was pretty disruptive. It led not only to strikes and to the end of the miracle, it then led to much greater labor market rigidity. Arguably, it even had some influence on the anni di piombo, the revolutionary period of the 1970s and early 80s. Why did Italy suffer from this? The usual explanation put forward by most Italian economists is that massive migration was very badly managed. The infrastructure wasn't there, the social conditions in which the southern migrants were put in Milan and Turin in particular were very poor. There was a rebellion against this. Perfectly plausible hypothesis, but let's not forget, Marcello Di Cecco reminded us of that earlier on, that in Germany in the 40s there were 5 million immigrants from Eastern Europe that were reasonably successfully integrated without any such strife. In Japan there were over 2 million returnees from Asia that were similarly integrated. And then during the Golden Age there was migration everywhere from countryside to urban cities. It was not a purely Italian south-north movement. Here are data that are not strictly comparable, but on the whole comparable. Intra-regional migration looks much larger in Japan. Probably the figures, if the truly comparable figures were there, it wouldn't be quite as big as is shown there. But almost certainly much larger than Italy. Germany seems similar to Italy, but let's not forget, as the footnote says, which you can probably read, that during the Golden Age, Germany received 6.5 million immigrants from abroad in addition. There were no immigrants from abroad in Italy at that particular time. Germany and Japan coped with migrations that were much larger than Italian ones. Italy didn't, and that, to my mind, points to a constant through Italian history compared to these two other countries. Not only inefficient politicians, boy, especially now, but also inefficient policies, inefficient institutions, bad policy making, corruption, and whatnot. And that contributed, therefore, to my mind, to the autunno caldo. Quickly on to the slowdown following the post-oil shock. Very different macro policies, similar growth trends, but very different macro policies. Huge very orthodox stance in Germany, was true before, is true since, it was true at that time, or fairly orthodox stance in Japan, but they liberalized a bit too much. Italy was the opposite. Initially, monetary accommodation all over the place was there for very sharp currency depreciation. Thereafter, monetary policy was constrained, but then fiscal policy took la relève, as French is no longer a language used internationally, unfortunately, took over, fiscal policy took over, budget deficits and debts exploded. Yet Italy grew. After all, not that badly. Orthodoxy would argue that this combination of micro-interventionism and macro-profligacy should have led to utter disaster. That is what all orthodox policy making does, and that's what dominates orthodox policy thinking today across the euro area. Italy grew. Why? Two not exclusive reasons. One is that perhaps, after all, orthodoxy gets it wrong sometimes, possibly even quite often. Expansionary policies don't necessarily lead to massive crowding out and to disaster and hyperinflation a la Weimar. They can also lead to relatively fast growth, even if nominal variables are growing too rapidly. The second explanation is totally different, and some people might argue it's the only one that matters, though there might be disagreement on that one as well. And that is that the industrial districts that took over at that time, partly because of the rigidities imposed by the autunno caldo on the large firms, were very successful. If you look at the market share, world market share of manufactured exports, just look at manufactured, I've got the chart here, it's in the paper. Over this period, Germany and Japan lose market shares, primarily to the four little dragons of East Asia. China wasn't on the scene yet. Italy does not lose market share over the 80s and 90s, and arguably the industrial districts helped, and they did grow very rapidly. This table needs about 25 footnotes because the figures are not homogeneous. I had to introduce East Germany to German figures, all sorts of things, but they nonetheless show that small firms do grow in importance virtually everywhere, not in Japan, but they were already very large in Japan. In Italy, between 71 and 99, the increase is remarkable, 10 percentage points. In Germany, it's 3 percentage points. In Japan, it's 1.5 percentage points. It was clearly an explosion of entrepreneurship in these industrial districts. Some people may not like them. I've heard it over the last 2 days, but I think they were pretty successful. Let me turn, not finally, I've got something more to say, to the stagnation of the last 15 years. As I said, the three slowest growing countries. Here life becomes more difficult and it's not as easy to explain. What is it that is common to these three countries or is in particular different for Italy? Globalization, actually, that shouldn't hurt anybody. We are economists, we believe in free trade. Surely we would all argue that globalization is a good thing. And it no doubt in many ways is. Arguably, however, for three different reasons, Italy may have been hurt or not helped as much by globalization compared to Germany and Japan. Firstly, and most simply, the commodity composition of Italian exports competes more directly with emerging market exports. That is not necessarily a bad thing. Competition galvanizes, but sometimes competition only hurts. And conceivably, Italy may have suffered from this increased competition rather than having gone up market, as shown by the zero productivity growth figures that Italy has recorded. Second, it's not in the paper, but will figure in the paper. Since all our economies are opening more and more, globalization leads to greater opening, larger foreign trade shares in GDP. That means that the real exchange rate matters more, almost by definition. Well, it just so turns out that the Italian real exchange rate appreciated massively, particularly during the Euro period, within the Euro area vis-à-vis Germany and other countries. Germany, on the other hand, in real terms, since the Euro exists, has depreciated in real terms within the Euro area, and Japan has, on the whole, seen more depreciation than appreciation. The third reason is more complex and may not be subscribed by everybody. Partly because of geography and partly because of history, Germany and Japan found themselves next to areas which they had traditionally traded, China in one case, Eastern Europe in the other, which were then closed by the Cold War, reopened up again, and both Germany and Japan traded much more with these new areas than Italy did. Italy is also close to Eastern Europe, of course, Slovenia, but the increase in the share of Eastern Europe in Germany was much greater than it was for Italy, and the same was true for Japanese trade with China. What did this mean? It didn't just mean exporting BMWs or Toyotas to Beijing and Warsaw. It meant, particularly in the German case, which is better documented, massive outsourcing and delocalization. German industry in particular exported a lot of its labor-intensive activities to Poland, to the Czech Republic, to Slovakia, and whatever, and now trades bilaterally. These are figures that show imports and exports as a percentage of total trade. Consequence of this, particularly for Germany, in Japan wages weren't increasing anyway because there was a period of deflation. German wage increases since the euro exists were extremely moderate. Italian wage increases were probably double those that Germany recorded over this period. And in addition, Germany recorded relatively rapid productivity growth, while Italy recorded zero productivity growth. The example I always give, because it's pretty incredible. Deutsche Telekom, 3 or 3.5 years ago, asked its workforce, look, boys and girls, you're not working enough. And it was true. They worked 34 hours a week, even less than the French 35-hour maximum. Right, so Deutsche Telekom imposes on its German workforce an increase in working hours from 34 to 38. Pretty substantial increase in working hours, which the German workforce accepts virtually without any strikes and protests. What do the Deutsche Telekom workers obtain in exchange for this fairly major concession on working hours in terms of increased wage packet? -6.5. Insult to injury. You work harder and you get less. If this had happened in France, they would have put Sarkozy on the Place de la Bastille and they would have cut his head. And Carlat avec, poor Carlat, like Marie Antoinette, would have made the same end. And actually, in Italy, it wouldn't have been that different. They would have executed Berlusconi. The only difference would have been that he's got so many girlfriends, it would have been a massacre, il massacro degli innocenti. Anyway, consequence, therefore, third consequence, Germany and Japan clearly benefited, according to me at least, a good deal more from globalization than did Italy. Italy may well have been hurt by some other aspects of this globalization, joining the monetary union, commodity composition, and not exploiting sufficiently the delocalization possibilities, which of course Italy did exploit to some extent. Romania, Slovenia stand example of that, but not as much as other countries. What else might have influenced this period? 3, as I call them, interlinked explanations. One is the lack of institutional change. The appeals for reforms in Italy are there also in Japan and in Germany. Arguably, more needs to be done in Italy than in either Germany or Japan. The indicator I use has its defects. It's a so-called freedom index produced by a libertarian, so it's extreme right-wing institute in Canada. It shows all the ways in which a government interferes tries to show. And here it is, the other OECD countries up there, the higher the index, the more liberal is the economy. Both Japan and Germany are less liberal than the rest of the OECD area. Both moved with ups and downs towards a bit more greater liberalization. Italy started much lower down, moved rapidly in the 1980s and in the 90s, but then in the last 10 years, the movement went into reverse. No great surprise. We've had the worst government Italy has ever had, apart from Mussolini, in its 150-year history. In addition, I would argue, and this comes with the third one as well, I'll spell it out in a minute, what I call resistance to change. Italy and Japan and Germany are very rich societies. Rich societies do not like change for its own sake. It's people who are hungry that push against the frontier. People who are rich don't. And Italians in particular are amazingly rich. These are OECD data. They show the ratio of accumulated wealth to disposable income of households. of the major countries, I don't have data for Sweden and for Switzerland, but of the major countries, Italy is actually the richest in the OECD area and therefore in the world. I repeat, I don't have data for Sweden or Switzerland, and Japan and Germany are also above the average of Britain, America, France, and Canada, countries for which I've got data. And this resistance to change is also, I think, a function of the very rapid aging, which in this instance is more rapid in Japan, as we all know. Japan has a stagnant population. Germany will soon have a stagnant population. Italy, thanks to immigration, doesn't quite. But all three are obviously much less dynamic in population terms than the rest of the OECD area, and all three are aging much more rapidly, particularly Japan, than the rest of the OECD area. As I always say, old people do not like change. Old people do not take new initiatives. Just look at me. When I look at, most of you are young, when I look at your young, enthusiastic faces, my heart, beh, lasciamo perdere. Three things, therefore, that to my mind all play a role, more probably for Italy, two at least of them, one obviously more for Japan. Japan, in addition, of course, has been afflicted by deflation. I don't mention it, but it is important. Let's remember that deflation is an extremely dangerous state of affairs. At which I then switch to a third problem that has plagued Italy. Well, a second one, actually. I'll turn to the third one later. The second problem has plagued Italy throughout, much more so than Germany or Japan. We have a Mezzogiorno problem. Germany and Japan don't have a Mezzogiorno. I've artificially created a Mezzogiorno for those two countries. My estimates are worth what they're worth. For West Germany, I have put poor regions at the outset of the period, early 50s, which are also poor regions today, and define that as Germany's Mezzogiorno relative to the rich regions. The poor Länder are Schleswig-Holstein, Niedersachsen, Rheinland-Pfalz, and Saarland. The rest of the country I consider the center-north of Germany, of West Germany. Obviously, since unification, I do have a Mezzogiorno in East Germany. And for Japan, I've similarly recreated an artificial division of the country, putting the southern islands, Kyushu and Shikoku, the northern island, Hokkaido, and the northern chunk of Honshu called Tohoku. I don't know how good your Japanese geography is, but take it for granted. It all makes sense. These were poor regions at the outset, are still poor regions today, and the rest of the country is the center-north of Japan. Look at the ratio of the per capita income of the poor region, the south, the Mezzogiorno of West Germany, the Mezzogiorno of Japan relative to the center-north of West Germany, the center-north of Japan, and then look at the ratio of the Mezzogiorno to the center-north of Italy. The gap is absolutely enormous. The regional problem in Italy was obviously much more serious. And interestingly, East Germany started in a much worse position than the Mezzogiorno in 1991, and has caught up very rapidly. East Germany looks like being a success, and therefore is not like a new Mezzogiorno, as I argued already 15 years ago, contrary to most people. Now, how much did that hurt Italy relative to Japan and Germany? I try a smallish counterfactual. I start with assuming that the famous Barra and Salai-Martin model of regional convergence, which argues that poor regions converge at 2% per annum on richer regions per capita income, which applies to Japan, applies to the rest of Western Europe, applies to the United States, but does not apply to Italy, would have applied to Italy as well. Consequence, but this is purely arithmetics, if the Mezzogiorno had grown that much more rapidly, overall Italian growth would not have been 3.4 over the period as a whole, the period for which I've got regional data, so it's a slightly shorter period, but 3.7. But of course, if that had happened, lots of other things would have happened. In particular, there would have been less migration, wages would have been higher, competitiveness would therefore have been lower up in the center-north, and Italy would, from that point of view, have suffered. There would have been some gains, but also some losses. The details are in the paper. Cut a long story short, taking these elasticities, plausible elasticities of various kinds from the literature, I conclude that, well, all right, you gain 0.3, but you actually lose 0.2. So perhaps the Mezzogiorno wasn't that much of a burden on the Italian economy after all. Except that, if the Mezzogiorno had been more successful, these I don't quantify, these are just qualitative statements, there would have been less migration, and therefore many fewer of the problems that then arose with the autunno caldo and followed the autunno caldo. There might well have been higher productivity in the north to partially offset the higher wages, and therefore it wouldn't have been as bad for export performance as suggested. A la Krugman, who's argued that a rapidly growing country create tradables, there might have been more tradable production in the south. And most importantly, there wouldn't have been either all the public expenditure that tended to be wasted in the South, and therefore there would have been lower taxes, and or better public expenditure spent across the country in infrastructure rather than in income maintenance in the South. Conclusion, therefore, almost certainly a much better performance for Italy, plus that huge externality. Bossi and Calderoli would have been minor functionaries in Varese and Bergamo rather than being major, sadly, major political figures. Right. Hence, tentative assessment, as I say, I don't quantify it fully, but surely Italian growth would have been significantly higher than the 3.4 that was recorded, almost certainly higher than Germany's 3.6, and probably quite close to Japan's 4.6. And I repeat, these are fairly approximate figures, but I think they go in, my estimates I think would go in that direction. Let me conclude. Overall trends were not that different. I've just updated the table for the period as a whole now. I said already before, 3.4, 3.6, 4.3, but Italy might have done better had it not been. And Italy was handicapped by three factors. One I've just mentioned, I'll come back to it in a second. This is the first one, these less efficient institutional administrations. I mentioned it in passing in the context of the autunno caldo, but we know it's a perennial feature of the Italian political and institutional scene. I don't have data to document this for the earlier periods. I have much more recent indicators of governance produced by the World Bank. Here are three of these indicators for 2008, 2009. Estimates of perceptions of government effectiveness in Italy, Germany, Japan. There seems to be a gap. Rule of presence or absence of the rule of law. There seems to be a bit of an even bigger gap. Control of corruption. Light years difference between the three. I repeat, these are perceptions, but the differences are so incredibly striking and probably were there in the 90s and in the 80s and in the 70s. They must have weighed negatively on Italian economic growth. The second thing, which I haven't mentioned enough, but it appears in the paper on a number of occasions, is the presence of much greater social strife in Italy. Italy had unions that were anti-market, anti-capitalist because of their political affiliations. It also had a managerial class that was very often egoistical and short-sighted. And if you look at the intensity of social strife in Italy through virtually the whole of the period, it is strikingly larger than it is in either Germany or Japan. These are data for the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. These are 6 decades of data on the intensity of strike activity in the three countries. Germans just never strike. The Japanese went on strike a little bit in the 50s and 60s, but thereafter completely forgot about it. In Italy, there's been a massive improvement over the last 2 decades, but the gap is nonetheless enormous, and that surely must have also had an influence on Italian economic performance over the longer run. And then the third one is, of course, the regional differentials I just mentioned. I'll illustrate them again with a slightly different indicator, weighted coefficient of variation. For all regions now, it's not south versus north, it's just the same number of regions, because otherwise the figures could be distorted if I put in 19 Italian regions and only 11 West German regions. I then put 16 for Germany as a whole. Even in that case, the differences are really very striking. So I'm left with a performance that was honorable, close to the German one, a bit less good than the Japanese one, despite the presence of at least these three. Other people might think of further reasons for why Italy was handicapped. But these three major handicaps in the Italian context, and despite these, Italy did perform extremely well. Why that is, I leave to Gianni Tognolo to answer. He's got to write the edition, the introduction. It's not up to me. The only conclusion I would say is a not very scientific one, but I think there's something in it. Italians are pretty smart. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Now the discussant is Michele Salvati, please.
Well, Andrea's presentation has been very, very brilliant. But I have to really read my discussion, which really prevent my discussion to be so brilliant as his presentation has been, because otherwise I won't keep in the 15 minutes, within the 15 minutes which I have of time which has been left to me. I'm also sorry to omit entirely the counterfactual chapter on Mezzogiorno and regional differentials. Okay, I'll try to stay closer to the mic. it really, the counterfactual chapter on Mezzogiorno really will need a discussion in itself. What would have happened if the Mezzogiorno really had grown, have reduced its differential with North? Above all, have to skip over a methodological premise on the use of comparisons, with which I really wanted to start, and which is written down here. Deep comparisons between 2 or 3 countries come up in 2 variants. Andreas follows the variant of what we call parallel comparisons. You won't agree with this, but it's a reason to discuss, in which each country is given a roughly similar weight. I prefer the variants of centered or skewed comparisons, in which only one country is chosen as a research objective, and the others one have only a subsidiary role as a source of examples on how things could have gone differently. Both variants have the advantages and disadvantages, but I'll come back to this in the course of the discussion. And in the end, rather trivially, my discussion will strictly follow Andrea's periodization. Now, reconstruction. In all the 3 countries, there was a mix of change and continuity in the social, economic, and institutional setup that proved very effective in paving the way for the big spurt of the Golden Age. Such a mix was more tilted toward continuity in Italy than in the other 2 countries. Why? Boltho rightly notices that, in comparison with Germany and above all with Japan, the occupying forces used in Italy a lighter hand and left more room of maneuver to the Italian authorities. There are many reasons why the Anglo-Americans did not insist for more radical social, economic, and institutional reforms, and accepted a greater continuity in the post-war Italian mix than in the case of Japan or Germany. But one is paramount: communism. And it's a bit curious that Andreas doesn't mention it. After some hesitation, the Americans realized that the mix de Gasperi was striving at was the best way to contain the communist internal threat and to make democracy comparable with the market system. An imperfect democracy and an imperfect market system. It is true. But had they insisted for tough democratic and egalitarian reforms, for a mix that deeply altered the pre-war distributional coalition, to use Olson's term, they would have jeopardized the conservative social and electoral bloc that de Gasperi was putting together around the Christian democracy. And the risk of a political development similar to the one in Greece would have been very difficult to avoid. For different and well-known reasons, neither in Germany nor in Japan such a risk was present, and the Americans could press for more radical reforms, breaking the fascist military coalitions and creating a more democratic setting. Would not have advantage in those countries the Communist Party, because they are left out or eliminated. Let me insist on this in a more general way, because it is the first time that politics is omitted in Boltho's account, and will continue to be so also in his accounts of the following phases of the post-war development. From my point of view, from the point of view of centered comparisons, this is a rather surprising omission. How can you fully understand Italian development if you keep out politics? True, the greater part of Italian economic growth and its key turning points are explained by international factors, by the catch-up process and by the changes in international policy regimes that we have experienced after the war, from Bretton Woods to neoliberalism and globalization. Fine. But a sizable chunk of the variance in the performance of our 3 countries have to do with idiosyncratic national factors, and among these, politics is paramount, at least for Italy. The constitutional setup, the party systems, the ideas and values shared by the Italian elites. This is only first reminder. I'll come back to this point. To close with the reconstruction phase, I add only one further aside, a small obiter dictum. In a general way, I agree with Olson's point about distributional coalitions and the advantages of really breaking distributional coalitions. But are we sure that a stronger America stance, a deeper change in the pre-war distributional coalition and tougher reforms would have contributed in Italy to a faster growth in the following phases? Probably so for a tougher agrarian reforms, though its consequences are pretty difficult to follow in a counterfactual way. But the Americans, and they'd be able to be more, insisted more, would have insisted more than they did and would have been successful in dismantling eerie and state-owned enterprises. Who would have bought them? The Italian private monopolists of that time, the Valerio, Faina, Valletta, instead of having the Senigallia, Menichella, or Mattei. Given the positive role of state-owned enterprises in the first phase, and I underline, in the first phase of post-war Italian development, is it difficult to see in the dismantling and privatization of those firms a growth-promoting move, for the time at least. Golden Age. Here I agree with most of what Andrea says and find this parallel comparison both simple and illuminating. Yes, the mainspring of growth were the catch-up process and good preconditions in all the three countries for hooking themselves to the 40th phase of the growth of the Golden Age. As Andrea says, backwardness provided the opportunity, social capability exploited it. Of course, Andrea adds immediately that social capability is a rather vague category, a sort of dustbin concept, in which almost everything can be thrown. In an attempt to make the concept more specific and to find comparable statistical evidence, in this section it throws in the dustbin only three things: educational achievement, the presence of cooperative institutions with less unruly unions and industrial relations, and the pressure of competitive forces. Fine. And the evidence shows that Italy, already at the beginning of the Golden Age, was in worse condition vis-à-vis Germany and Japan, and that it did very little in this period to redress the disadvantages in all the three big fields we mentioned. A small aside about competition, rightly emphasized by Boltho, also in his presentation. The Japan example shows that unrestrained external competition is not such a necessary prerequisite for growth, after all, and that adequate internal competition and an intelligent industrial policy can in some cases be a better substitute for it. The Japanese achievements in radically changing the unfavorable specialization of industry at the end of the war, which was even more tilted than the Italian ones towards low-tech sectors, illustrates the points very clearly. But this throws into the social capability dustbin category other two variables: the competence and the efficiency of the public administration, and the capacity of the political system of setting and maintaining, through time, policy goals favorable to growth. On the competence of the public sector, there are several asides in Boltho's paper, referring not only to industrial policy, but to other policy aspects in which a good public sectors make a difference. But on the political system, there is very little, and I already noticed. And here comes the major difference between a parallel and a centered comparison. Keeping the comparison strictly parallel, or reasonably parallel, you will object to that. In a short paper, Andreas is forced to spread his scarce resources over too large a front and to select a kind of evidence that is common and easily available for all the three countries, as for the case of the three variables, which he throws in the social capability concept. These are well chosen, as I recognized. But on the one hand, they are not the only ones. On the other hand, they are not immutable, as we noticed about the industrial specialization. It is true that Italy started with worse endowments for all these three variables. But what impeded that, over a span of time of more than 60 years, substantial improvements were reached in all the three fields and in other fields? Schools and universities, and education as a consequence, could have been bettered by a stronger effort on quantity and quality. Competition responds to institutions that could have been built and to rules that could have been enforced, as they actually were, though very late. And industrial strife is also very sensitive to rules and institutions and to government decisions. They are not eternal damnations. Why Italian governments, both in the latter phase of the Golden Age, but above all, in the more turbulent phase of the post-oil shock, didn't tackle with sufficient energy and determination a few key problems that seem so evident now with the benefit of hindsight? More, if one takes a longer view, he has to recognize that beyond the three fields that Boltho selects in his social capability concept, Italy started with deep, long-run problems that seem less amenable to reformist policy, or at least to a policy with quick returns. The Mezzogiorno is the key one, and a good Palermitan like Andrea is very conscious of it, though unfortunately cannot go into the counterfactual exercise of Section 5. Mezzogiorno then. But also the quality of our public sector belongs to those problems that can only be solved by a constantly held, powerful, and often unpopular reformist effort, very difficult to sustain in a democratic policy. Even these kind of problems, however, going back to the state and nation-building phase of our countries, are amenable to alleviation, if not to solution, if they are tackled in a proper way. They are not eternal damnations. If this is true, how to omit political variables from any attempt at explanation? This is the main question that, as a follower of the method of centered comparison, I would ask Andrea. Post-oil shock period. Macroeconomic mismanagement and an extraordinary turbulence in industrial relations are characters that stand out very clearly when one compares Italy with Germany and Japan over the period of 73 to 95. I have very little to add to the competent and balanced treatment of Andrea. Only one footnote, and the usual, more general criticism coming from a supporter of center comparisons and to the role of politics in explaining economic policy and economic outcomes. The footnote has to do with Andrea's endorsement of a well-known Giavazzi and Spaventa thesis asserted in an article in 1989 that monetary accommodation and lax fiscal policy after the second oil shock allowed profits, investments and growth to remain higher than in the case a more orthodox monetary and fiscal policy had been followed, as was happening in the other two countries. This thesis never convinced me fully. Which would have been its later costs? Giavazzi and Spaventa underplay its consequences on deficit and debts, maintaining that the causes of deficits are to be found in the original shock of the early 70s, when revenues stopped to rise and keep the pace with expenditure. After that, nothing was added, so they say. True, but much could have been subtracted during the early 80s through a more cautious fiscal policy aiming at a deliberate reduction of public deficits, which is what the authorities of the time were proclaiming and writing in their budget documents, only to verify later that their objectives had not been reached. So, if there was a favorable effect on growth, and I agree that there was one in those years, limited to those years, this was wholly preterintentional, not due to an explicit objective of sustaining growth, but to their political inability to cut expenditures to raise taxes. And its cost for later taxpayers and for foregone opportunities of growth in the future have been substantial. An immediate gain for growth against a potential future loss. The net consequences are difficult to ascertain if one is a bit skeptical about far-fetched, counterfactual examples. As for my usual point about the central role of politics in explaining important aspects of post-war economic growth, this is the phase in which it comes out most clearly. The original sin of post-war Italian politics, the presence of a large anti-system party which had to be excluded from the area of government and represented at the time, which was the time of Fordism, a large majority of workers, of industrial workers, was less evident until the early 60s, during the period of centrist governments. It became transparent when full employment and social modernization eroded the conservative majority and forced the Christian Democrats to an unusual alliance with the socialists. Macroeconomic mismanagement, the variables on which you concentrated, which is true, of course, and the extraordinary power of labor unions come from that. No? The poor Ugo Lamalfa was the vox clamas in deserto, in the very desert of the government of that time. And also for the reasons why in Italy was so sensitive to industrial unrest and to autunno caldo and all that, no, in the early 70s. That is, that real immigration has been not rule enough and all that. This is Graziani's thesis. You know, you drink too much. On this source, I think. I don't think this is really one of the mystery of this is that very enormous industrial migration had taken place also in other countries. They didn't have such consequences. The reason why they did in Italy was because of the presence of the Communist Party, because of the presence of a situation in which really a government, a powerful enough government, was impossible really to build up. And anyway, it's this kind of interpretation. I really can go into it, but really I don't want to superimpose my idea on yours. But really, I don't really believe too much in the idea that that was a necessary consequence of the sufferings of the immigrants in the north. with a different political leadership, both in the government and the opposition, this could have been really gone up in a different way. Semi-stagnation. With the early 90s, all the three countries entered a period of semi-stagnation, so the available statistical material witness. But they entered it for very different reasons, so different that one is led to doubt whether a comparison is of any help for the last years. No, a comparison is helpful when the same mechanisms are at work, albeit in a different form. In this period, it seems to me, the similarity is mainly restricted to semi-stagnation, to the outcomes of those mechanisms, to the effects, not to the causes. The painful digestion of the German unification, the Japanese financial and real estate bubble, the foreign exchange crisis and the fiscal stabilization process in Italy are shocks that have very little in common, I think. Of course, common factors can always be found, and two of them, well analyzed by Andrea, are very important. The first one is the impact of globalization and the loss of competitiveness vis-à-vis emerging countries. Japan, Italy, and Italy are great industrial producers and exporters, and the heightened competition of the last 15 years has heavily hit Italy, the weakest of them. The second one is population aging, a variable for which our three countries are at the top of a hardly enviable league table. But these are slow-moving variables, structural variables. Whereas I tend to believe that the common semi-stagnation vis-à-vis other industrial advanced countries has more to do with the shock factors I mentioned. And these are hardly comparable. In a parallel comparison and in a short paper, when the causal mechanisms at work are different and country-specific as they are for the shocks that hit Italy, Germany, and Japan in the early 90s, it is difficult to provide a full analysis. The paper will become really too long. No, all the same, I think that Andrea should at least have hinted at the problem of shocks versus slow-moving structural factors, at least in a general way. It is a problem we often encounter in a historical analysis, after all. Conclusions. Andrea's paper is really just as brilliant as his presentation has been. It's really extraordinarily useful paper, and it will be a pleasure to read it. And very useful for anybody who wants to understand the growth mechanisms at work and their variety in the long two phases, Golden Age and globalization, that capitalism has experienced after World War II. Given the approach I followed in the discussion, I end picking up a pretext, an excuse for hammering again on my main methodological point about centered and parallel comparisons. The pretext, the excuse, is a phrase I quote from Andrea's conclusion. Had Italy had a more efficient state, more competitive industrial relations, less severe regional problems, its growth performance would have been significantly better than it was recorded. It's difficult to disagree with this statement, but I have to add two small remarks. The first one is that the same could be probably said, changing the name of the factors, of course, the reduced growth below the maximum potential, also for Germany and Japan. If the analysis were centered on those countries. Netting out actual growth from negative factors is possible, but it's a hazardous counterfactual exercise, and which will be the league table of potential growth, because now we will be comparing potential growth without retarding factors. Where this netting operation possible, it is very difficult to establish. Maybe Japan will come out better than Italy in that case, in the retarding factors which exploded in the crisis of the 90s. The second remark is that Andrea's quote risks resembling a famous joke, a common punk in this country. If my grandmother had the wheels, she would run faster than a car. To avoid this risk, one has to enter a deeper historical narrative, showing first that a more efficient state, more normal industrial relations, less severe regional problems were in the realm of possibilities, not like the wheels of our grandmother. And explaining, second and most important point, the real gist of the historical method, why these favorable possibilities over 60 years were not pursued. Center comparisons may be useful, I think, for both purposes. I hope that Andrea will forgive me for my final impertinence, and I leave the discussion as that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, first question.
I just comment on the relationship between Italy and Japan. I think that they are two very distant countries, but very close in one sense. In both of them, the state played a role, an important role in the economic development. In Japan, since the Meiji Restoration, and in Italy, practically since the unification. But at the point after World War II, there was an important difference in this kind of relationship, that the Japanese state, in a sense, retreated, while the Italian became more involved in the economy. The Japanese state reached a kind of square in the circle because it gave companies protectionism, subsidies, selective subsidies, and even regulated prices, but compelled them to compete on the global market. This is the story, for instance, of the famous Japanese steel sector. And that was made via guidelines, via moral suasion. There were the famous Monday club, Monday meeting between the head of the MITI, the Ministry for Industry and Trade and International Trade, and the guys of the major steel corporation, in which they met I think, once per month, the last Monday of the month, and the guy spoke, the other listened, and then each went on his own. But the companies knew that if they would not have complied with what the head of the MITI said, they were troubled. They were in troubles. In Italy, in a sense, it happened the opposite. We had the improper financial burdens and the endowment fund, but nothing in exchange. And why that? Because Japan had a real state where bureaucracy was more important than politics. The two ministries, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Industry and International Trade, that was the real government. And so the difference was the state. I think this is an important issue. I know that developmental state is any more on fashion, but I think it's still important. And very important were the industrial relations. The industrial relations in Japan were as conflictual as in Europe after World War I. But then they were changed. And was very important World War II, because after World War II was made the major restructuring in the cadre, in the hierarchy of industry. And the workers and managers were deeply linked because they fought together during the war. And they launched the companies in incredible investments because they relied a lot on workers. Then I have a question for you. How comes that organized crime is clearly an obstacle to Italian economy, while in Japan it is not? It was not, at least, during the almost 40 years of development.
Giovanni? No, quick.
Yes, I think that we ought to take also into consideration, in order to assess the causes of the relative decline of the Italian economy vis-à-vis the German or the Japanese one, the fact that in the early 70s, 72 I think it was, there was a fourfold increase in the price of oil. And Italy was most heavily hit by this fact because we were more dependent than any other country on oil. We had no coal, different from Japan, Germany, France, or the UK. We had no coal. Those countries could revert to coal, we could not. So that was, for us, a very heavy worsening of the terms of trade. And I think that that's at the root of our poorer performance in the subsequent years. Also because, given the size of that worsening, it was very painful to carry out the process of adjustment, domestically. In other words, to lower the living standards for the people. Thank you.
Well, my point is just related to the last point of Franco, that is I feel that Andrea could greatly improve his analysis if he tried to elaborate a little bit the role of trade unions within the industrial relations issue. The role of trade unions, comparing Germany and Italy especially. I have in mind, I have no knowledge on this in this respect, but the impression looking at the market, labor market situation, and how German trade unions managed to become beyond the Mitbestimmung, but they managed to become actors of transformation, of reaction to, and in the Italian case, much more defensive. That's this could be a theme to elaborate a little more.
Scusa, dai Giovanni, dai, no, ospiti prima.
This resonates a bit to what Franco Motori was saying before. At least in two sessions, the previous session, the one where Franco, Matteo, and Andrea were presenting, and in the technology yesterday, you had essentially a micro story telling part of the miracle and part of the subsequent slowdown that had to do with technological and organizational factor of the Italian industry. This, in your story, is not there so much. I would like to see how your story relates to the unfolding of the story that on industrial structure, industrial organization, and technological capabilities.
Oh, it is just a methodology point, because I'm not sure that I agree either with Michele or with Andrea on the counterfactuals. I don't agree with Michele that in order to make a counterfactual, this needs to be historically plausible. Counterfactual is a very simple technique. I think it only work if it's you build two general equilibrium models, ideally. One general equilibrium model of the reality, and the other one a general equilibrium model with just one missing variable. And it helps just to understand whether this variable, whether it was possible to change it or not, how much it impacted on a given historical situation. If you contain your exercise, and if you're able to do your general equilibrium models correctly, then I think it's a very helpful way of thinking. If the counterfactuals are so big that they involve so many variables, etc., it's difficult, even intellectually, to think of a counterfactual. Then I think it is very not so useful. So I think I don't agree with you that they need to be historically plausible, and I think that Andrea stretches the counterfactual a little bit too much.
My point is the general economy of the discussion is very small and very marginal, but I think it provides some food for thought, linking this paper with the previous one. I think you mentioned the relevance of small firms in Japan comparing to Italy and the difference with Germany. But I think that you should be very careful because the nature of the small firms in Japan is completely different from the one you have in Italy, because in Italy, basically, you have a high relevance of industrial districts. In Japan, small firms are basically subcontractors in the big keiretsus. And this means that big business is much more relevant than statistics show in Japan.
Okay, Andrea, the floor is yours.
What you give me? As much as I want. Good, thanks.
Well, 3 minutes.
I'll go in reverse order, I think. Some of the questions I can answer very, very quickly. Yours, you are perfectly right. The nature of the small firms is different, but in fact I don't do any real comparisons. All I select is a particular episode during which Italian small firms gained weight, and I think that helped Italy. I have a table that shows Japan, but I don't draw any conclusions on that. On Gianni Tognolo's point, counterfactuals are actually essential for all sorts of purposes. How are you going to... Republicans you'll never convince, but how will you convince independent Americans that what Obama did worked? The only way to do it is via a counterfactual, and pray God will succeed. Economists will succeed in showing it, and Obama will be re-elected. Small chance. This being said, I know you don't like my counterfactual, you told me, so I'm in fact very pleased with it. I agree that it is very broad, very wide. It doesn't just look at one variable, lots of things. On the other hand, I've never seen anything done on the Mezzogiorno, even as elementary as what I'm doing, and therefore I'm going to keep it in the paper, whether you like it or not. Giovanni Dosi wants too much. I'm not going to do it. The paper is twice as long as it should be. I'm not going to go into microhistory and develop that sort of stuff. Fabrizio Nida asks about trade union structure. There is, in fact, a discussion of trade union structure in the paper, which is very pedestrian. It basically looks at the Calmfors-Driffill model and argues that Japan, Italy, and Germany fit each one of the three models that Calmfors and Driffill postulate. The optimum ones are the highly centralized and the highly decentralized models of trade unionism, and Germany and Japan would fit those two. Italy is closer to the intermediate models of trade unionism, and that one, from a macroeconomic point of view, looks much less than optimal. Again, I haven't got much time to go into the details, but if you go into the Calmfors-Driffill paper, you'll see references to that. Who asked about... Oh, no, that came before. German unions, why did German unions behave the way they did, apart from the structure, the centralized structure of unionism? The Metal Workers Union was the sort of leading in the wage negotiation. That I can't tell you. There may have been one example of the open ways in which German trade unions behaved. They were in favor of free trade. They were in favor of unilateral tariff reductions in the 1950s, something that the government was in favor of. You would have expected trade unions to be dead against unilateral tariff reduction. They were actually in favor of unilateral, they were in favor of the common market, total opposition to, for instance, what Italian trade unions would have done. Now, that is not to be linked to the Calmfors-Driffill story. That's a completely different aspect, which leaves you bewildered. And you say to yourself, why? Maybe that the liberal tradition was just stronger in the intellectual, cultural liberal tradition was stronger in Germany and was influencing even unions. But that's a bracket. I'm not going to use it in the paper. A point was raised about the importance of the oil shock for Italy. Two things I would like to say. Firstly, the macro impact of the oil shock was virtually identical in Italy and Japan. Japan was virtually totally dependent on oil imports. Coal production had come to absolutely negligible proportions by the early 1970s. There was somewhat more of it in Germany, you were absolutely right, but even there, the impact was very, very large. So the differences are not that pronounced. And secondly, an oil shock that changes the relative prices and that in any case is then reabsorbed by a massive oil price decline cannot really have an influence over 30 years of history. It can have profound macroeconomic impact in the first few years, but eventually, in the English sense of the word, not eventualmente, eventually those things are reabsorbed in a normal market economy. So I wouldn't want to stress too much the importance of the oil shock. Bruno Amatori told me a lot about Japanese state forcing competition, etc. It's actually an issue I've looked at in detail, and I'm not so convinced that the Japanese state was quite as far-reaching and forward-looking as you are suggesting. There might well have been an element of chance in the fact that fierce competition occurred in Japan in the 1950s, internal competition between the various Keiretsu groups. Perhaps it was the Ministry of Finance and MITI who encouraged that competition. I'm not 100% convinced they actually encouraged it, actually necessarily even wanted it. Bureaucrats don't usually like very strong competition. I think it arose more from chance than not, but that's a different issue. We can't go into it now. I've discussed it with Japanese bureaucrats, and they have different opinions as well on this. Let me finally turn to Michele Salvati, who actually exposed some bits of my paper much more eloquently and better than I did, in particular the 1950s and 60s. I'm not 100% clear, I've got to read his comments, what he means by paralleled and a centered comparison, so I will not discuss that issue. I know that Michele has the extraordinary knack of combining political analysis with economic analysis. I sadly don't have it. He's extremely good at that. He knows his economics, but he also knows his political history, and therefore manages to put the two together. I'm no good at that. I don't know the political history. I'm not a political scientist. I'm barely an economist. Some people might say not even that. And therefore, I've always restricted myself to largely economic comparisons. I find what he said interesting. I'm not sure I can actually introduce it myself, other than possibly the odd reference, because some of the odd references are interesting. In particular, I was very interested by what he said about the Reconstruction period. Let's assume the Americans had pushed Italy more, which I would argue would have been a wonderful thing, etc. Then perhaps they might have dismantled Erie. Well, I hadn't thought of that one. But it's true, it's a perfectly plausible assumption to make. Erie was probably in the 50s, at least in the early 60s, a mainstay of the economic miracle, as lots of Italian economists have argued, and therefore the benefits of greater American intervention might not have been quite as beneficial as I might have thought. On the other hand, America would have introduced a lot more competition. The dismantling of Erie might have been a mistake, but the fact that lots of other Italian oligopolies and monopolies might have been weakened, severely weakened, might have compensated after all. But I admit I hadn't thought of that particular possibility. Yes, Michele is right. I select three things: regional differentials, social strife, and lack of competition and whatever. And he says, well, over 60 years, those things are not invariable. They could have been changed. Why were they not changed? Because of the political structure, because of the compromesso storico, and all sorts of things that color Italian political history. That may well be the case, but as an economist, I select economic variables that I think are crucial to explain certain periods, or the period as a whole. That's an even greater counterfactual. If Italy had not had a communist party as strong as it did, what would then have happened? I don't think Gianni Tognolo would be happy. He doesn't like my counterfactual. Imagine a counterfactual that brings in the absence of the communist party in Italy, the absence of, therefore, let's not even go into it. Post-oil shock, Michele is not convinced by the Giavazzi-Spaventa argument. There I would say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Here is a country that clearly misbehaves according to all and every indicator of orthodox economic thinking, yet manages to grow. I'm not saying that. I admit there is a cost, which I did not mention, and you mentioned. The growth at the time was perhaps bought with a much higher public debt at a later stage, the public debt we're living with today, and which is influencing the spread and whatnot. The spread actually is Berlusconi, but never mind. That is admittedly a subsequent cost, and therefore perhaps I may want to temper my judgment that says unorthodox policies perhaps are a great thing. Well, perhaps they're not a great thing, they're not as bad as people suggest. Finally, to the last point, which is, I think, worth mentioning, and I will try and take it into account, stagflation is explained by some common elements, few more than you are thinking, at least in my mind, but it is true that there are three very different aspects to the three countries over this period. The unification shock in Germany, deflation in Japan, very serious problem for Japan. Unification was a very serious problem for Germany, and Italy had the Ciampi entering into the euro and then not adapting to the euro, being in a currency union in which the country did not behave as it should have done. And this is very different from what happened in Germany, very different from what happened in Japan. So it's true, there's greater heterogeneity in the stagflation period that I'm allowing for.
Thank you, Andrea and Michele.